You're listening to Advice from Your Advocates, a show where we provide elder law advice to professionals who work with the elderly and their families.
Welcome back to Advice from Your Advocates. I'm Bob Mannor. I'm a certified elder law attorney in Michigan, and we have a practice where we focus on helping folks that have chronic illness, and particularly things like dementia and similar illnesses. And today we're going to take a little bit of a different approach for the podcast. Today we're going to talk to someone about their personal experience. So Sarah Cart is with us. She's written an excellent book called On My Way Back to You. We're going to talk about her personal experience. And I think this is really valuable for our community to talk about our experiences. And so I know often we're going to have a physician, or we might have a nurse or a social worker talking about specific details. But today, I think it's important to talk about our own journey. And everybody's journey is going to be different, right? Everybody's family situation is going to be different. But I think we can get a lot of hope and help by discussing our own journeys. So Sarah, welcome.
Thank you, Bob. I'm honored to be here. Thank you very much for asking me.
So talk to us a little bit, Sarah, about your life and your journey here, and what your experience was. Obviously COVID's been front and center on all of this and all of the shutdown, and trying to deal with the healthcare industry, and COVID was a horror story at times. So tell us a little bit about what you've gone through and what your journey's been.
Our journey began when my husband, Ben, was diagnosed with an autoimmune issue back in the winter of 2016, 2017. And the caregiving learning curve at the start was pretty, not very steep. One step at a time. We were told that his issues would be handled symptom by symptom, and we were doing a great job with that until fairly suddenly we weren't. The disease migrated from his GI tract to his joints and his tendons, and eventually got to his heart. And by the summer of 2018, he needed a pacemaker. And by the summer of 2019, it was obvious that his only hope for survival would be a heart transplant. And in the meantime, he and I were preparing for me to be on my own, because we pretty much knew he had a death sentence. So we came into COVID trying to get him onto the heart transplant list. And that's an arduous process. And he was just getting sicker and sicker. And 2 weeks after the pandemic was declared, his kidneys shut down, and he ended up in the hospital. He wasn't yet on the transplant list. And because of hospital protocols to do with COVID, I was not allowed to visit him. In the midst of all of that, they finally got him on the list. Then he was off the list because he was too unstable. Then they put him back on the list, and they were about to take him off the list again when a heart was allocated. So the surgeon said on the way into the OR, this is 50% of the battle. The other 50% will be recovery. And what we didn't know until a week later was that Ben also had a broken hip. So,
oh my goodness.
So when he finally came home to me, 10 weeks after going into the hospital, he came home with a new heart in a wheelchair, because they couldn't do the hip until he was strong enough for that. And he was dependent on opioids for pain relief. So my caregiving journey at that point went from 0 to 100 miles per hour overnight.
Sarah, in our experience, a lot of our clients tell us that working through the hospital and rehab and home care and all of that, it almost seems like a maze at times. We talk about that children's game, Chutes and Ladders. I remember playing that with my kids, and you get all the way through the game. It seems like you're making great progress, and all of a sudden you slide back down to the beginning. And that's been our client experience in dealing with this. And it's just the nature of the beast kind of a thing, that when trying to work through the healthcare industry, there's so many moving parts. We have to deal with the transitions between the hospital and rehab and whatever the next step is. We have to deal with the medical cutbacks. And it sounds like that your husband had quite a few of those. Talk to us about that, your experience first of, trying to just cut through the clutter and cut through all of the multiple sources of information.
Our situation was unique to us in that it was the midst of COVID, so I couldn't visit him. Yeah. Then we were dependent upon all the nurses and doctors facilitating or community patients with each other, and also all of my advocating on his behalf was via phone or Zoom call. But it certainly wasn't unique to anyone going through hospital stuff in the spring of 2020. We were just one of hundreds of thousands of couples dealing with that kind of thing, families dealing with that. So the COVID complication, I don't know how many of our issues were COVID related and how many of them were just the red tape that is out there. But there were certainly many times when one step forward was followed by 2 or 3 or 8 steps back. We were blessed to have good insurance, and that was never really an issue for us. The issues that drove me nuts and made me lose sleep at night were after he came home and trying to get the home care support to work. As I said, he was in a wheelchair. He was on opioids. He had a massive bed sore, which was the other hurdle we needed to get over before they could fix his hip. And my kids say this is going to be on my tombstone. I'm just an English major, but for me to have to deal with that bed sore, I was in over my head. And that was not the only wound he had. He still had a wound from his trach. He had places where they'd done catheters up to his heart through his groin. So I mean, there were all kinds of things that needed to be addressed. And the home healthcare agencies that were supposed to be helping us were very interested in our good insurance and not necessarily very interested in actually showing up and doing the work. We had one healthcare aide who just said to me, that part where they tell you that that dressing needs to be changed every day, that's not really true. They go for 3 or 4 days. And he's a heart transplant patient, and it's COVID, and I'm an English major, so I'm in total panic. Anyway, the people who came through for us finally were the third agency that sent a nurse who came out on a regular basis. And by the time she was showing up, 4th of July was approaching, and so she was going to have several days off because of the holiday. And when she first said that, she could see on my face that I was in shock. I was frustrated. You're the first person I can rely on, and now you're telling me you're not going to be here. And she was wonderful about saying, I'm not going to be here, but I'm going to show you what you need to know to get through the next 5 days. And she finally stopped and educated me. Nobody else had taken the time to educate me. They've just been giving me excuses on, if you live in the Florida Keys, you're far away, and it's difficult to get there, and it's COVID, so we don't have the personnel. She was wonderful. Don't know how we would have been better served if it hadn't been a pandemic.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. Obviously, the pandemic was threw everything out of its standard, and but I think people will continue to struggle with these types of issues, even after the pandemic. Even today, we're in 2024 now, and there's still shortages on caregiving, on finding workers for home health companies and things like that.
Yeah,
so.
and I don't think I'm giving anything away about the book. I mean, the book has a happy ending. The book is about how Ben's health declined precipitously, how he nearly died, and how he, in fact, found his way back to me. But I don't think it gives anything away to reveal that within 3 weeks of his coming home, somebody filed a report with the State Department of Children and Family Services regarding elder abuse. The state's laws are that needs to be investigated within 24 hours. So this lovely young woman shows up at our house, and she called ahead of time. She told me where she was from. She told me that she needed to come talk to Ben. And Ben was thrilled. Ben was recovering, but he did not have all of his executive function yet. And He was just delighted to have this lovely young woman come sit and chat with him about how he'd had a heart transplant and how his hip was broken and what needed to happen next. And I needed to stay in the room because Ben is hard of hearing. It's COVID, so we're wearing masks, so he can't even read her lips. And so when she said, "I'd like to talk with you alone," to Ben, he said, "Sarah needs to stay. She's my translator." But all I was allowed to do was to take off my mask and repeat her questions so that he could understand what she was asking.
Right.
And not until after she left did he realize, and she had him sign a bunch of paperwork, and had left copies of that with him. So I took her and escorted her back to the car. When I got back to where he was sitting in his wheelchair, I think, and looking through these papers, he said, this looks like we need a meter. What's going on here? And I said, depending on what she says in her report, they could remove me from our home, or they could remove you from our home. We don't know. We were totally clueless through that whole process. We did get in touch with a lawyer that night, and he was wonderfully reassuring about, this is the way the state law works, and you are probably not cause of this investigation. It's probably that you're on your third agency in less than a week. But we never heard any kind of resolution about it. The state agency called us a couple of times to see how we were doing, but they never said the case has been resolved, but this stuff happened.
I agree with you on this. As far as in Michigan, we call it adult protective services. Even I get a little nervous when I hear that adult protective services is coming in or investigating in a matter that we're working on. And I can't imagine what the families have to feel about it. What's interesting about it is there are times where I find that adult protective services can cause certainly a lot of anxiety, but sometimes it can, cause issues with moving matters forward. A lot of times it's actually the opposite. We've worked with adult protective services on a number of cases where, let's say we have somebody that doesn't really have a lot of financial support, and they're able, to initiate some court processes that they really couldn't afford to do on their own. And now adult protective services is taking on that burden. There's some situations where adult protective services can help us get to the head of the line for caregivers. There's a program in Michigan called Waiver. It's a home care program through Medicaid. There's a waiting list. And so through adult protective services, sometimes they can help us get to a higher spot on the waiting list so that folks can get the care in their home that they need. I think that's what I'm hearing from you is one of the real important things to you, where you were able to care for your husband in your home and that he didn't have to go and live in a nursing home.
We were very fortunate on that score, and I do appreciate that the agency was doing its job and could have been that there could have been a time when we needed them to be advocating on our behalf. What was scary for us was the report of elder abuse and not knowing where that had come from, and the sort of paranoia of who's watching us and who's saying something, because we were both doing our best. It was just a challenging moment at a time when I already felt challenged. I was suddenly responsible for 20 prescriptions and 3 hot meals a day. Ben had come home from the hospital where he had 24/7 undivided attention of all kinds of medical personnel and janitorial staff and nutritionists. And because of COVID, he came home to just me on my own, trying to manage all of those things. So the abuse filing was like out of the left field and really, really disconcerting at a time when I was already disconcerted.
Well, that brings up a really important issue, and you've addressed this in your book, but the issue of making sure we're taking care of the caregiver too. So I'm sure you've heard this, that often the statistic is that the caregiver spouse often dies first. And I know you guys were younger, but that is a very common statistic, that a caregiver spouse all of a sudden is thrown into this. And you described it very well. In just a short period of time, you went from having to manage all of this, plus the anxiety of the investigation and just the stress of everything. You talked about losing sleep and work with clients on is to say, okay, I know we're here to talk about the husband, but we need to make sure that the wife, that whoever the caregiver spouse is, that we're taking care of them, we're giving them proper support, we're giving them some respite, some time away, some time to regroup, and taking some of the burden off. Because what you described is exactly right. You go from 3 shifts of people, multiple people taking care of somebody, to going home, and for the most part, you're a 24-hour caregiver. You're taking in place of 3 shifts of multiple people, and you're now having to do all of that. and it's incredibly challenging. So talk to us a little bit about your experience and maybe how to make sure that you're taking care of yourself too.
The hospital and rehab were both very good about calling me and putting me through Zoom call training sessions on this is like, I probably, I don't know how many different sets of personnel I talked with: physical therapists, nutritionists, doctors. The nurses, when Ben was discharged from the hospital to rehab, actually made a point of calling me. And at that point, they didn't have to. I didn't need to hear from anybody until he was discharged from rehab. The nurses made a point of calling me and saying, your husband talks about snakes and reptiles a lot, and he needs to not touch any for at least a year. So that's the kind of attention that some people were offering me, and I deeply appreciate all of that. But the reality, it's one thing to go through a Zoom call and have a nutritionist list all the foods he's supposed to have, or the pharmacist tell you which meds he's supposed to have when. And it's another thing to be sitting there looking at all the piles of pills or looking at the empty meal tray and thinking, okay, what am I going to put on there now? I'm a list person, so there were lots of lists, there were lots of checklists, and that was very helpful. I journal when I'm panicking, so I did a lot of journaling, trying to make the time to journal. Someone had suggested to me, since Ben had to be in a different room than I was in, we couldn't be roommates while he needed a hospital bed and a commode by the side of the bed and all those kinds of things. Someone had suggested to me a baby monitor, which was an awesome idea. He had the main unit by him, and I had one by my side of the bed and one in the kitchen and one by my desk, so that all he'd have to do, kind of whisper, like, I need your help. And I could get to him without him having to go to the stress of calling for me or yelling for me. Meditating. I did some meditating. My family and friends are like, really? You took the time to meditate? I guess that's maybe just a sign of how stressed I was, that I was making myself take the time to do that. That was very helpful. And I'm also someone who needs to walk, not because I want my 10,000 steps a day, but because I get antsy. And if I don't move or swim, I go a little nuts. So those were my forms of healthcare. I was also very fortunate. And maybe this was because of COVID and everybody was sheltering in place and had their special COVID pods and bubbles. But people were wonderful about reaching out via phone, via text, via email, or taking me for walks where we're standing 10 feet apart. We were a subject of a lot of people's attention, and that was a huge blessing. I'd go for a walk and I'd come home and there'd be a bag of bagels on my front doorstep, or a bouquet of flowers, or one time I walked in and there was a meal on my dinner table. Someone knew that I had been away on a walk and had come in and left a hot meal for me. So I was very fortunate that way.
Very nice.
The support system's important.
Let's talk a little bit more about your book. It's a really engaging book. On my way back to you. So what inspired you to write a book about your experience?
Well, I've said that I journal, and after all was said and done, there was a lot that I needed to process about Ben's experience, about our experience. Ben calls it my book, my story. I call it his book. It's his going on the hero's journey, starting. He started out great. He got really sick. He had to leave home. He had to endure a lot of adventures while he was gone. And then he returns home a changed person with a lot more of just adjusting still to come. But I needed to process things like having missed the fact that his hip was broken when he left home as his kidneys were failing. And that was, it wasn't an oversight. It was that we were overwhelmed by how sick he was. He had so much going on. I did notice a couple days before his kidneys failed that he was popping ibuprofen like it was it was jelly beans. And I asked what was going on, and he confessed that he had fallen asleep on his way back from the commode to the couch at 2 a.m. and gone over like a tree in the living room. He was sleeping on the couch because he was sleeping so restlessly at that point that he didn't want to fall out of bed 3 feet from the bed to the floor. That 18 inches from the couch to the floor made a little bit more sense to him. But so here I'm his caregiver, and I missed that he had a broken hip. He probably never, because of his autoimmune issues, we're not sure that he ever would have been accepted as a heart transplant candidate. But he was in the hospital, and we forget that at that point of the pandemic, you'd drive in your car to get a COVID test. Someone would scratch your brain with a cotton swab, and you had to then wait for 3 or 4 days before you got your results. So the only people who were being taken into the OR were emergency situations, a car accident victim, a gunshot wound, or in the case of the transplants that happened that spring, at least at the hospital where Ben was, people who were already in the hospital so sick they were dying, but the hospital knew they were COVID-free, and they would take them into the OR when an organ became available. So I needed to process that. He shouldn't have gotten a transplant. He got a transplant. He also, oh my goodness, never would have gotten a transplant if anybody had known about the broken hip. So there was a blessing in our having missed that. There was a lot to go on, and the part where I had to take care of him on my own. I mean, like I go back to, I'm just an English major, and they trusted me with keeping him alive. I mean, that was my responsibility, and that was an overwhelming thing. I was lucky enough to be able to break it down into smaller pieces and handle it and get help when I finally needed it. But going into it, I didn't know that was how it was going to turn out. So
I know your book has gotten a lot of accolades. I saw the quote from Kathy Lee Gifford that and that was a wonderful quote. I'll summarize it. It said something to the effect of, after reading that book, well, she didn't know you, she'd like to know you. And I thought that was a very nice quote from Kathy Lee.
Yeah, I'm hoping to meet her one day.
Yeah. She and others. It is a very engaging book, and you've gotten a lot of really interesting people that have read it and have enjoyed it. And so I do encourage folks to pick this up. It is worth reading. And one of the things in the book that you talk about is some practical advice, and I kind of would like to go through that. So I'm going to, quote some of or not quote them, but just kind of go through the list, and then I'm going to ask you to kind of answer each of the 3 things, or each of the 4 things separately. You talk about, in dealing with all of this and just trying to cut through this maze, what questions to ask, and I thought that was an excellent way to word that. Then what notes to take. So what signs that you shouldn't overlook, and making sure that you have self-care. So let's start back at that first one. In this situation where you're having all of this input from all different sources, what questions? What are the questions that we want to remember to ask?
You need to ask what they're going to be handling and what you're going to be responsible for. And will there be, for lack of a better description, continuing education? Phone numbers. How do I reach you in an emergency? What does an emergency look like? When Ben got his pacemaker, we needed to know what I don't know what they call it. I call it a correction. They didn't, but if his pacemaker was triggered, what were our responsibilities at that point? And so you just, if you don't know the answer, it's not a stupid question. Ask.
Right.
If it's something that's going to keep you up at night, ask. Don't hesitate to ask the questions. Ask for help.
Those are excellent questions. I want to kind of circle back to that first one of making sure that you're clear on what are they going to do and what are you expected to do. I wanted to circle back to something that you talked about earlier with your insurance, and saying, okay, the insurance was providing some folks to come in and help out and change the dressing and things like that. Typically, insurance is going to provide, whether it's Medicare or, you were too young for Medicare, I believe, so you were on regular insurance. And so it's going to provide what we would usually refer to as skilled care. In other words, a nursing assistant, a nurse, a physical therapist, things like that. Is that primarily, insurance wasn't paying for somebody to come by for hours a day to help them get dressed or to help them shower, things like that. That was not the type of things that insurance, I'm guessing, based on my experience, that's accurate.
It was, PT, which ended up not being useful. I mean, right from the start, when he came home from rehab, a PT person came by a couple of times, and she was wonderful that he finally said, with the broken hip, without more guidance, I can make this worse rather than better. But he was also great about saying, here's when you are able to get him in the shower, this is going to be the best way to do it. And then just giving us, we're newbies, giving us some basic information. But gait belt, I had heard of gait belts before, and maybe it's because I write. I'd always heard it as GATE. And when I finally realized that it was GAIT, and it has to do with how a person walks, it has to do with their gait.
Yeah.
It made a whole lot more sense to me. But teaching us how to use a gait belt. A home health aide was supposed to come by to help with the shower, again, with a broken hip and not being able to move more around. We didn't do that. We were dependent upon, but I think it must have been an LPN, licensed practical nurse, to come in and change the dressings. And in an ideal situation, that person would have visited right before the home health aide. Then, a home health aide would have visited right before the LPN. So if we'd known when the LPN was coming, I would have been able to get him in and out of the shower with the help of the home health aide. And then we would have the licensed practical nurse to apply the various medications and reset his dressings.
And I think that goes to your point about asking the question of what's going to be covered and not. And I think that's important for our listeners to remember that, sometimes you're going to have to supplement it with other things, whether it's family, whether it's paid caregivers, paid out of pocket, things like that. But the big question, I think, is a really important question that you raised is, what are you responsible for? Whatever the caregivers are coming in, the skilled people that are coming in, what is your job? What are you responsible for? What are the outer limits? When are you going to be able to do your job? You raised some very good points there of we can't do physical therapy under these conditions or traditional physical therapy under these conditions because it could actually make it worse. That's a really important question. So I just wanted to highlight that because I agree with you. Asking the right questions for older folks and our clients, sometimes the families are dealing with a dementia diagnosis. One of the things I always encourage our families to ask more questions like, what can you give us an idea of what we think the specific diagnosis is rather than just sort of generalized dementia? And I think that's what you're going to. You want to know as much as you can. And sometimes if you don't ask the questions, you're not going to get it. If you hadn't, if the look on your face when your nurse was going on vacation wasn't, a little bit of panic, there might not have been that education to say, hey, I'm going to get you through this. And so those are...
And there's a learning curve to learning who all the various agencies are. And I thought that I was just going to be dealing with the rehab facility said, we're your central information system. If you have any problems, you can call us. But there was also the healthcare agencies, and then there was like a middleman kind of agency that would call and say, or we're calling on behalf of your insurance company to make sure that you're actually getting the care that you're supposed to be getting. I had no idea who that was or that such a thing existed. So there just more and more people called in their official capacities, and I had no idea who they were or what their capacities were or how that system was structured, much less how it worked.
The next one on here is what notes to take. And I think that was an interesting one. I hadn't thought of it that way, but you wrote down what notes to take. And I want to inquire more about that.
I was taking notes at all of Ben's doctor's appointments from the beginning, partly because that's how I manage information. I hear it better if I write it at the same time. And that would also give us the material we needed before we go back to the next appointment to say, okay, here's what you said last time. Here's what's happened since. How do these things connect? How do we make progress on this? One of Ben's earliest doctors in all of this, as I'm taking notes and I'm writing numbers down, blood numbers and such, stopped and said, I can see that you are taking this down, and I can tell I can take yours and Ben's temperature right here, right now. You think that you can improve that one number. You can't. That number is what it is, and that will be that number for the rest of Ben's life. That's so. It was an educational part of my taking notes. Also showed the doctors that we were paying attention and that they would take the opportunity to educate us further about different things, not just what questions they might inspire. It was also important to be able to look back and say, here's when he started this medication, and it was those kinds of things, or here's when that symptom started.
That can be very important. It's one of the things I know families that I work with struggle sometimes is sometimes for the legal and sometimes for the insurance or benefits, we need to know the progression. We need to know certain dates. And that's often can be a struggle for families because they're going through this whirlwind of everything that's going on. So I agree with you. If we can, keep good notes and especially keep a kind of a timeline of things that can help. And it can also help you keep some perspective. Talking about everything that had occurred in the 1 week time period that you were referencing when you first came home. That can be helpful to kind of have that. This is the timeline that we dealt with there. The next one you have is, and I think this is really interesting too, signs not to overlook. So I'm curious if you could tell us more about that. What are the signs not to overlook?
They can be really subtle. In Ben's case, the first sign that anything was wrong with him was he had always been able to just whistle with one hand. And when we're at a wedding and they introduce the bride and groom after the exchanging of vows, and everyone's applauding what Ben does, and I automatically, my hands go up over my ears because I know he's going to do it. He's going to do this ear-splitting whistle. Yeah. And I see out of the corner of my eye that instead of just doing it this way or this way, which he never did, he reaches up like this, and then he holds his fingers closer together. And I didn't ask about it at the time. I asked about it in the car on the way home. And he said, it's just my fingers are a little swollen. And what do you mean your fingers are swollen? That's really weird. Oh, no, it's okay. And I said, is there anything else? Oh, well, yeah, they kind of change color when I'm cold, or when I go from cold to heat. And so I ratted him out a couple weeks later when we went to get our flu shots. And our doctor said, gee, Ben didn't mention that, but I'm not giving him his flu shot today. We're going to do these blood tests instead. So we were lucky enough by my having nudged him and ratting him out to have his autoimmune diagnosed before what is typically the initial symptom of that particular autoimmune had even been evidenced. And so you have to trust your gut. I mean, I'm not saying be paranoid. I'm not saying go onto the web and search every little thing. But if something's odd, speak up and ask about it. I would say ask about it rather than look it up on the internet.
Right. Good idea. And then we talked about this one, the fourth one, which is self-care and self-care for the caregiver spouse. So anything else you want to add on that? Because I do think that's incredibly important.
The statistic that you were citing about caregivers predeceasing their patients, I've heard that, and I've seen it twice in our family. My father predeceased my stepmother while he was caring for her, and Ben's father predeceased Ben's mom under the same things. And you need to not forget that you are a human being with needs. Don't hesitate to ask for help. Don't hesitate to forgive yourself. There is a learning curve, and you're not going to get things to do with caregiving perfect on the first go round. You might not get them perfect on the 8th go round either, but be forgiving of yourself and of others who reach out to help and support you. The sanity aspect of it is crucial.
Absolutely. Well, Sarah, this was a very interesting conversation. Thank you so much for writing the book. It is available on Amazon, so if you would like to pick it up, that's one of the ways that you can find it is on Amazon. Anything else, Sarah, that you'd like to leave us with for families that are dealing with this? Or a lot of the listeners to the podcast are actually people that are, in the healthcare industry, so social workers and therapists and things like that listen to this podcast. So anything that you want to leave to either the family caregivers or the professionals that work in this industry?
First, to the professionals, I do have a few friends who are doctors who have read it, who have thanked me for writing it because they said, you learn about in med school, you're supposed to pay attention to the patient and the families. But it's a reminder, especially one very good friend of ours who's been in the OR thousands of times. He said, I forget that it's my job, but for you, it was a miraculous thing that he came out of the OR as well as he did. And the other thing that made our miracle possible is organ donation. If you are considering being an organ donor, please let your family know that that's something you feel strongly about, because for us, a family in what has to have been their darkest moments made a decision that enabled our miracle, and it also, I believe, enabled a miracle for at least 4 other families because of the numbers of organs that were able to go out, and the ripple effect from that. It's not just a heart, it's not just a kidney, it's not just that one patient, it's that patient's family and friends. It's really, really powerful, and we are so grateful to those people for making that decision in a really terrible moment.
Absolutely.
So.
Well, thanks again, Sarah. And for our listeners, don't forget to subscribe. You can listen to this podcast on any place that you can find podcasts. Will you find us there? Or you can go to our website, mannorlawgroup.com, and there is a link to the podcast, or, like I say, any podcast service that you use. Don't forget to subscribe so that you know when the next interesting topic will come out. This was very enlightening, Sarah. I appreciate everything that you've done to spread the word and share your story.
Thank you, Bob. I'm glad to be here, and I really appreciate your giving me the time and the forum.
Thanks for listening. To learn more, visit mannorlawgroup.com.